let's get started. This training is about epilepsy surgery for vision educators. And so we're going to assume most of you, all of you have some training already around the brain. So we'll do quite a bit of a refresher as well during this 2-hour presentation. You need to just raise your hand in the chat if you have a question, and Audrey will take your questions or read them off to me. Sometimes I can speak too fast or I start to get going. So if you want me to slow down or repeat something, that's not a challenge for me. All right. What you need to know about epilepsy first is that there are 3 treatments for epilepsy. The first is what we call medical treatment or medication. The second is called surgery, and the third is diet. And we don't often hear too much about surgery as a treatment option for epilepsy. So most of this presentation is going to be around this treatment option, which should be offered to children who have what's known as drug-resistant seizures. Some facts about pediatric epilepsy. Every year, about 40,000 children in the United States are diagnosed with epilepsy, and this is more than all pediatric cancers, juvenile diabetes, and cystic fibrosis combined. But it is a grossly underfunded illness, and it's really unfortunate, but funding obviously drives research, and it's very poorly funded, so getting research around epilepsy is really difficult. 1/3 of those children, so somewhere between about 9,500 and 12,000 per year, will have what's known as drug-resistant epilepsy. And this means their seizures are not responsive to medication. How do you become drug-resistant? The test is actually very easy. Just remember the number 2. Once a child has failed 2 appropriate and tolerated medications, their chances of a third medication controlling their seizures drops to about 4%, and their chances of a 4th medication controlling their seizures drops to about 0%. Those medications have to be appropriate for the type of epilepsy. Some medications are not right for certain types of seizures, and the medication has to be tolerated. So the child, for example, cannot have developed a rash from the medication or have significant behavioral problems. So if they're appropriate and they're tolerated, and the child is still having seizures after 2 meds, they now have drug-resistant seizures. And this is when a child should be referred to an epilepsy surgery evaluation. Why do we care if a child's seizures are drug-resistant? Well, that's because they can cause some very challenging medical issues that we'll kind of cover in the next slide. After failure of 2 drugs, the child should be referred for a surgical evaluation. But unfortunately, epilepsy surgery is underutilized in the United States and frankly in all countries around the world that offer this. Only about 1 to 11% of children with drug-resistant epilepsy have some type of epilepsy surgery. And there are many factors that are very complex that form these very powerful barriers to getting that child to an epilepsy surgery evaluation. Medication-resistant seizures, many of you, I'm sure, have experience with them with the kids that you serve, can be very dangerous. They can cause severe brain dysfunction. Approximately 40% of all children with drug-resistant seizures have intellectual disability. They can cause severe autism or autistic characteristics because of the way they disrupt the formation of important neural circuits in the brain. They can cause developmental arrest or regression. So you may see that these children may stop walking or they don't reach milestones when they're supposed to because of that ongoing seizure activity. They can actually cause structural brain damage to the brain, slow or no language development. I know my son lost the 20 words that he had at one time when his seizures returned after his first surgery, and he's never spoken to me again since that time. So personally, I understand what drug-resistant epilepsy can do to a child. In its most severe cases, it can cause organ failure or damage, and then sometimes even death. There's something called sudden unexplained death due to epilepsy, where the children die for reasons that we don't fully comprehend. Anti-epileptic medications can also have a pretty severe cognitive impact on kids, with some research showing that there's a 4-point IQ drop for every anti-seizure medication that's used. There are a lot of myths about epilepsy surgery. One thing is that there is a very high mortality rate. Some parents in one paper believed that the perceived death rate from having brain surgery to treat seizures was 55%, or that over half of kids pass away during surgery. The actual rate of mortality is about 0.6% and actually less. I've spoken to many neurosurgeons about it, and death because of epilepsy surgery is really just exceedingly rare. You just really don't hear about it too often. And the complication rate, things like brain swelling or stroke, are less than 5%. So we have to work really hard at overcoming some of these myths about epilepsy surgery. Oops, there's a typo in here. Sorry about that. Many folks think that drugs are the only treatment for epilepsy. We think that you can have a pill that cures it or stops it, but there are other treatments for epilepsy. Like I mentioned before, surgery is the treatment that you're supposed to be considering after your child fails 2 drugs. And then as parents, most often that we think that the risks of surgery are worse than a lifetime of seizures. That's another typo. Sorry about that. That should read a lifetime of seizures. But the truth is, as I mentioned before, you can have structural damage, you can have organ failure, you can have cognitive decline, you can have all of these side effects from the ongoing seizures that happen over time. Lots of barriers to surgery. We know that persons with higher income have a shorter time to surgery, so that if you're poor or have low socioeconomic status, it may take up to a year longer for your child to be referred for a surgical evaluation. Children who have private insurance get to surgery faster than those with public insurance. And then even those that have insurance, private insurance, sometimes those insurance authorizations can delay evaluation. Travel costs associated with surgery are not covered by insurance, and many of these procedures, especially when we start to talk about the big ones, are not performed at all hospitals. So a parent may need to fly with their child, hundreds of miles away to get to a big facility that does these surgeries often. Sometimes they have to fly to yet another facility for some type of imaging, and none of these travel costs are covered by insurance. So that, of course, can create yet another barrier. And then, unfortunately, race looks like it's a barrier as well. 69% of white children with drug-resistant epilepsy who have epilepsy surgery. Latinos, it drops down to 9%, African Americans 7%, and then other is 8%. We really have some very big barriers that we have to overcome regarding getting to surgery on time. All right. When I talk about epilepsy surgery, what do I mean? You have to think about these procedures as first falling into 4 categories. The first is where parts of the brain are removed. The second is where parts of the brain are destroyed. The third is where parts of the brain are disconnected from another part of the brain. And then the third, which isn't typically considered epilepsy surgery in most situations, but now there's a lot of these new devices that stimulate or modulate the brain. And those are now considered sort of, if you think about the entire toolbox of surgeries that are available when medications don't work, if we were to put all of these in a toolbox, these would be the general categories of surgeries that you would have. Surgeries have 2 goals. So we can one of two goals. So we can kind of also break down the different procedures as falling into these two different goal buckets. The first is obviously the one that we want the most, and that would be a goal of curing the surgery, curing the seizures. So these big procedures that we'll cover called hemispheric surgeries, which both Audrey and I have children who have had half the brain removed or disconnected. Those fall into the category of hemispheric surgery, and those can be anywhere from 50 to 85 to 90% successful at stopping the seizures. And remember, when we talk about this compared to medication, medication has a 0% chance, but that can be as high as 85% chance with a big hemispheric procedure. There are multi-lobar procedures where various lobes of the brain are removed. Sometimes the temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe is removed. That's called a TPO. Surgeon might just remove one lobe, like the temporal lobe, and maybe the amygdala and hippocampus below it. Or you may have just a lesion removed. And a lesion is any area of malformation or damage in the brain where the seizures start. So the surgeon will go in there and take that out somehow. Other types of surgeries are what's known as palliative surgeries. These surgeries, the goal is to reduce the seizures. We'll cover multiple subpial transection. I missed one here. Corpus callosotomy is another palliative surgery, and then all of the neuromodulation devices that we'll go through. Does anybody have any questions so far? No questions? All right, I'll keep going. I don't see any questions in the chat. The first thing to understand is when we start to talk about all these surgeries, how does the surgeon get in there? The most traditional type of procedure will be something called a craniotomy. And that's when the surgeon is actually removing a big piece of bone in order to expose the brain and either take out the lesion or a lobe or disconnect. And this cute little guy here is my son, who had a functional hemispherectomy at 3 months old. And that is what his craniotomy looked like. Those were 65 staples, which, by the way, got us into first class the first time we flew with him. About a month afterwards, the flight attendant said, "Holy cow, what happened to him?" And she bumped us up to first class. It was really nice of her. The second way that surgeons might choose to get in there is some of these newer ways is through much smaller openings in the brain so that they can ablate the lesion with laser, or they may make a craniotomy, a small craniectomy, excuse me, to get tools in there so they could take out the piece endoscopically, or not make a hole at all and do something very new called radiofrequency ablation. So here's laser ablation. This is the Medtronic device, where you can see here, there's just really, honestly, just a tiny little hole that's made about the size of a pencil. And then this long, thin probe goes in, and with heat, sort of like a lightsaber, the piece of brain that's problematic will be ablated. It depends on the size of the lesion as whether or not the surgeon decides to open the skull completely with a craniotomy and take out the piece by cutting it, or whether they go in with the laser, which typically can only get very small areas of brain. But this laser ablation procedure is really becoming more and more popular for obvious reasons. There are side effects to having such a large craniotomy. The recovery is much faster with laser ablation. We've got some kids that go to school 2 days after laser ablation, like they have it on the first day, on the second day they come home, and the third day they're ready to go back to school. It's quite remarkable. Oh. Am I going the wrong way? Sorry about that. Okay. The second way they might go in is through a small craniectomy. So if they're doing an endoscopic procedure, you would have an opening, about this big. One surgeon said it's like about the size of a big Band-Aid. And then the tools can get in so that the surgeon can endoscopically disconnect or remove the part of the brain that they need to get to. Something that's really quite new, I'm almost afraid to mention it because it's not used in many places, but there's a lot of chatter about it. And this is something called an intensive focused ultrasound, where they're destroying the problematic parts of the brain without an opening at all, but they use a focused ultrasound to destroy it. So we're really keeping an eye on this. Obviously, if there's no need to open up the skull, that's much better for recovery. But again, very new. There's a facility in India that's really sort of at the forefront of developing these procedures that has started to do this quite a bit. And I think Miami's doing it as well. So we're keeping an eye on this procedure there. I don't know what's going on here. I keep going in the wrong direction. Okay. So again, if we're going to look at these various different procedures, lesionectomy takes out a small part, lobectomy may take out a whole lobe, and then some of the structures from down below, like the amygdala or the hippocampus. Multilobar procedures, you may have multiple lobes removed, and then a hemispheric procedure is removing or disconnecting half of the brain. In a corpus callosotomy, this is a palliative procedure. The corpus callosum, which is a massive band of neural fibers that connect the left and the right side of the brain, is disconnected, and this can be a partial corpus callosotomy or a complete corpus callosotomy. It can be done open, again, where the surgeon opens up the brain from the top, or they can do it endoscopically or by laser. It's most successful, sorry, another typo in there, not having a good morning here. It's most successful for what's known as drop attacks. So these tonic-clonic seizures where the child all of a sudden falls onto the ground. A lot of these kids have to wear helmets. This is best for that type of procedure, that type of seizure. And it typically does not stop all seizures, although it might in some children. There's also something called a multiple subpial transection. We'll talk about the peel layer in a bit, but this is when the surgeon will go in and instead of cutting deeper, they will make these tiny, 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 tiny little cuts along the top of the brain so that when the seizures start, they don't spread across. And again, this is palliative because it does not stop seizures completely. If a child is not a candidate for a resection or a disconnection or one of these surgeries that destroy part of the brain, then there would be discussions about one of the stimulation devices. Also, often parents don't want to go there in terms of epilepsy surgery. They're just afraid of anything entering the child's brain. So they many times choose the vagus nerve stimulation first. And this is, again, a palliative procedure. It stops seizures in something like less than 15% of the children, although about 75% of kids do have some type of response, some type of seizure reduction. It can take some time to, ratchet the device up to a level where it's responsive to the seizures. But this is generally a very quick procedure. They put in an implant in the chest and then it connects to the vagus nerve in the neck and will modulate the seizures that way. So really not a brain surgery at all, but it is a surgery for seizures. I'm terribly sorry. I'm having a challenge here with these slides. One of the newer devices that's around is called a responsive neurostimulation or an RNS implant. It goes in a small pocket that's made in the skull through a craniectomy about the size of a Band-Aid. And then this device goes in and these leads will typically go into the outer layer of the brain or deeper where there are seizures and reduce the seizures with this kind of modulation device. This is really, really very hot right now with a lot of facilities that are starting to use this device. And we are seeing a better seizure control rate than the vagus nerve stimulation with this device, depending on the child. And then the final type of neurostimulation device is called deep brain stimulation. And this is a palliative procedure that goes deep into the thalamus of the brain in order to control where the seizures are transferring all across to other parts of the brain. Do we have any questions so far? Could you repeat the statistics for VNS units? 75% of children are responsive, but less than 15% have seizures stop from a VNS device. Now, VNS is 100% a palliative procedure. It is not intended to control seizures. It reduces them. Any other questions? All right, I'll keep going. Play this. This is a video that was made based off, I think it's approximately 64 EEG leads that were placed on the skull of a typically developing adult. This is going to give you a great idea of how the brain works together and how the different regions communicate. We've talked about the surgeries to treat seizures, but it's really important for us to understand that the neighborhoods of the brain, the different parts of the brain, you're almost familiar with the occipital lobe probably, they all work together. Everything is interconnected. And if I have one goal from this presentation today, is that you stop thinking of the brain as regions, different lobes, but you start thinking about this as this beautiful, complex network of connections that are constantly communicating with one another. Let's start with the main regions. You have your cerebrum. This is the part of the brain that has its very familiar folds and grooves. And then you have the cerebellum down below. We're not going to talk too much about the cerebellum in this presentation. And the brain has two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, two sides. If you were to take those two hemispheres and flatten them out, because remember, they're all folded up. If you were to flatten them out, they'd be about the size of a napkin, about the size of a dinner napkin. And at around, I think it's around the 6th month of gestation in utero, the brain starts to fold and fold and fold and fold and fold so that it can all get into the cranium and fit right. If we're going, now we're talking about surgery, sort of how the surgeons get in there. They have to pass through the skull and the layer of the skin, the muscles of the skin, underneath the skin, and then get to the skull. And then there are all these different layers below the skull that they have to go through. The dura is this very thin leather-like lining of the brain that is, I think it's impossible to tear manually. You know how you can't tear leather with your hands, you can't rip it, so to speak. The dura is very similar to that. Then there's a layer called the arachnoid. Some of you may have a kid who had a subarachnoid hemorrhage. That's kind of a condition that comes up sort of often. That means that there's bleeding below the arachnoid layer. And then the pia it looks like a layer of cellophane that covers the entire brain, all the folds, everything. Remember, I talked about a multiple subpial transection. That means the cuts that the surgeon is making in that procedure is actually going below this very clear layer, and that is what protects the brain as well. And also is bathed in the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, I have a question for all of you. If you take out a piece of the brain, will it grow back? Does anybody want to give that a shot? If you take out a piece of the brain, will it go back? Ellen says no. Everyone's saying no, 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 no. No, but other parts of the brain could learn to take over the job. That's right. They could exploit the existing connections to learn to take over the job in some areas, but not others. Most notably, for example, in vision, if you remove the entire occipital lobe, you're not going to be able to recover that contralateral vision. But yes, you're absolutely right. The brain will not grow back. Okay, let's go back to our familiar brain here. Remember, I said I'd love for you to think about the brain as connections. So this is an artist named Greg Dunn. Go to his website. It's spectacular. And he takes MRI slices, images from MRIs, and sketches them with these beautiful micro etchings on gold with light behind them. So this is about 500,000 neurons from an MRI image. And you can see here the intricate connections that are coming from all over the brain. Here's your olfactory bulb. So this is your nose, and these are the connections that are coming from your nose. This is your cerebellum. Which structure has more neurons, the cerebrum, this part, or the cerebellum? Anyone want to give that one a shot? Ellen, I think that's the first time you've ever gotten anything incorrect. It's actually your cerebellum has more neurons than your cerebrum. Your cerebrum has around 30 billion-ish or so, 30 to 40 billion neurons, and your cerebellum has around 60 billion. Feel like we should be paying more attention to the cerebellum. And when somebody talks about cortex, you may have a child with cortical dysplasia that's had surgery. Cortex is this outer layer of the brain where the neuron bodies are. And then here are all the fibers coming from each neuron body. If you think of a neuron, I like to think about it as a balloon. That's what helps me. The neuron body is here. Here's the axon that communicates information down to the axon terminal. And this axon terminal eventually connects with another neuron. And the information always goes this way from the neuron body to the axon terminal. It doesn't go the other way. So now if we start thinking about every neuron as balloons, so there's your layer of neurons here, and here are all the connections coming from the neurons. So when somebody's talking to you about gray matter versus white matter, the gray matter is the body of the neurons and the white matter are the connections. So if we go back to our beautiful image from Greg Dunn, this is where your gray matter is, and this is where your white matter is. What if we cut the white matter? What if we cut those connections? Would they grow back, or would they reconnect if they were cut or destroyed? It is beautiful. Yes, I agree. I love Greg's art. If you cut the white matter, if you cut those connections, would they grow back? I have one yes. They do not grow back. Thank goodness they don't, because remember, one of the surgeries that we do is called disconnective surgeries. Sometimes when seizures return, if a child has had a big disconnection, like a true total corpus callosotomy, or if they have had a disconnective hemispherectomy, like a functional hemispherectomy, some parents will say, I think the brain reconnected. And we have to remind them that no, once white matter is cut, it does not grow back. It does not grow back. And here's just a beautiful image of how complicated the neuron connections are. Here's a layer of cortex. You see, now we're really starting to see how very, very complicated and dense these connections can be. And then here's just a slice of the brain, gray matter and white matter. In 1 square millimeter of your brain, you have about 50,000 neurons. So you can just start to see how very complicated it is. when seizures, for example, when they're trying to localize where the seizures are coming from. Sometimes the MRI can say that it doesn't see anything in the brain, but it's possible that there's cortical dysplasia or some kind of malformation that's so small that the MRI is not picking it up. It can be really challenging for our families when they're trying to figure out where the seizures are coming from. All right, let's talk about connections a little bit. We're not going to talk about the connections from neuron to neuron because these are sodium channels and ion channels that honestly are extremely complicated, and I'm 100% not qualified to talk about them. We're going to talk more about these beautiful connections here. When the neurons, remember, I like to think about them as balloons. When they start to bundle, they form a bundle of neurons, which is about 1,000 fibers is in a bundle, and then they start to form tracts. And these tracts communicate with other parts of the brain. So this is a human cadaver brain, and now you can see how very complicated these connections are in real life. And here you see a massive tract here that will eventually go down to the body. And each sort of line that you see, each fiber is really about 1,000 fibers. And here is again, the tracts that go from one side of the brain to another part of the brain on the same side. So when we start to think about kids that have had surgery, for example, to the occipital lobe, you can see why that might impact another part of the brain that has other functions, because everything is connected. And here's yet another image of the white matter connections in the brain. Extremely complicated. No part of the brain really is acting alone. Everything is acting together. And the biggest connection that we have is the corpus callosum. And this is a commissure. Commissures are connections that go from one side of the brain to the other. And this is about 200 million fibers. Does anyone know if there are other connections that go across from left to right? Or is the corpus callosum the only structure or the only fibers that go from left to right, or vice versa? Dr. Zuccarelli keeps getting it right, everything right. You actually have 6 other connections that go across. And this is really challenging for the families that in our community have had hemispheric surgeries where the surgeon may have missed one of the other connections that go across. And so the family will say, well, they had a hemispherectomy, everything was disconnected. And we'll say, yeah, but it looks like they missed this connection down here. And I know that personally because my son twice had missed connections and the surgeon kept having to go back in. So commissures are fibers that go from one side to another. Association fibers go from the same side of the brain to other part of the same side of the brain. Important to think about this a lot when you start thinking about the dorsal and ventral streams of vision. Those are association fibers primarily. And then projection fibers go from the brain down to the body and eventually form the spinal cord. And this is just some beautiful imagery of MRI with diffusion tensor imaging. So you can see here's the corpus callosum. Remember, I said that was the massive band, but look at the other connections that you have that go across so that the brain can communicate. This is why kids who have had corpus callosotomy, especially the younger they are, you really don't see many challenges with their visual perception or their motor function. They may need a little bit of physical therapy or something post-operatively. Why? Because they have these other connections that are picking up the slack. As Dr. Zuccarelli told us earlier in the chat, when we're talking about function. When an adult has a corpus callosotomy, you do see more impairments. They might have something called disconnection syndrome, where the two sides of the brain just can't function together. So they may be able to see something in their right visual field, but they can't name that object because the connection to the part of the brain that's responsible for naming an object has been cut. And these are just all the different types of connections that you have in your brain. When you're working with a child that has had any type of epilepsy surgery, personally, I feel it's important to try to get a copy of the surgical report. That will give you a clue into what has been disconnected, what's been removed, so you can see whether they're going to have challenges with the parts of the brain that are trying to communicate with one another. You know, if you have a frontal lobe resection, is it close to this tract that may cause a communication issue with another part of the brain, for example? I've talked to you about the connections, the high-speed highways that the brain uses to communicate with each other. Now we're going to go into the neighborhoods of the brain, how, you know, different neighborhoods, what their responsibilities are. But remember, I'm continuing to keep asking you to think about the brain as connections. We're going to talk about how these various parts of the brain are connected to one another. Parietal lobe primarily receives sensory input from the body. It's responsible for body part positioning, spatial orientation, visual processing, and final sound processing. Skipping over to the temporal lobe, when you think of temporal lobe, think of hearing. So sounds come into the temporal lobe, but final processing is done over here in the parietal lobe. A temporal lobe is also has a lot of involvement in memory, emotions, and language. It's where the visual word form area is in reading, as well as expressive and receptive language. Primarily on the left side, but the right side of the brain also has language involvement. Frontal lobe is responsible for voluntary movement. That's primarily out of your motor cortex. So somebody that has Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, for example, has deterioration of here, the motor strip, so that the body is unable to receive signals for movement. It's also responsible for expressive language, planning, organization, and that kind of thing. So often children who've had frontal lobe resections may have some pretty significant ADHD challenges. And then the occipital lobe, which you're all familiar with, this receives vision. It's also part of vision processing. It's also where the visual word form area is in part included there as well. The visual word form area actually overlaps the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. And then the cerebellum, which again, we're not covering too much, will deal a lot with coordination, balance, equilibrium, muscle tone, emotional processing. And there's some research now that it's involved with speech production. But these regions do not act alone. So remember, we talked about the connections coming from all over the brain. If you have a resection in the occipital lobe, if the message can't get here or here, you may start to see challenges with functions that are primarily reserved for these other parts. Then there's something called the insula, and that's sort of a little mini fold of cortex covered by another piece of cortex here. Sometimes kids can have seizures that come from there. And this is really challenging because these seizures from the insula can mimic seizures coming from other parts of the brain. So when they're looking at what's called semiology, which is how a child moves their body during a seizure, that can kind of give you hints as to where the seizures are coming from. It can get really confusing if they're coming from the insula because it can mimic seizures from elsewhere. But insula is responsible for your visceral sensations, a lot of involvement in autonomic control, interoception, auditory processing, gustatory, like your sense of taste and your sense of smell as well, and some socio-emotional. If kids have had part of the insula removed, and this would happen in hemispherectomy, which is one of the bigger procedures, but you need to find this out because that gustatory, for example, you know how some of the kids don't like how their food tastes or they may have sensory issues. We think it has a lot to do with the fact that the insula has been resected in some of these kids. One other thing, we won't talk too much about the thalamus today, other than what I will mention here is the thalamus is the grand central station of your brain. It distributes information from every part of the cortex, the higher function up there, from all over, except your sense of smell. So when parents are looking at responsive neurostimulation or deep brain stimulation, you may hear them talking about placing the electrodes in the centromedian nucleus of the thalamus. This is because, remember, we think of the brain neurons as balloons. If you were to grab all of the neurons and hold them in a bouquet of balloons, the thalamus, I think of it as the fist holding that bouquet, so that if you put the electrode in there, if the seizures are coming from all over, it's going to stop those seizures from going to the body if you're putting the electrode in the thalamus. My son had so the thalamus is two hemispheres or two sides. One of his thalamus was removed on the left side during his second surgery because the surgeon wanted to make sure that seizures coming, if they were coming from the other side, that they weren't going to go elsewhere. Any questions so far? I've covered quite a bit. Dr. Lawrence, it's nice to see your name in. It's been some time since we've connected. Dr. Lawrence, Linda Lawrence is on our scientific advisory board. No questions? Tell me if I'm saying something wrong, Dr. Lawrence. All right. Let's cover the occipital lobe. This may be redundant for many of you, but the occipital lobe is obviously at the back of the brain here. This is a image, obviously, of just one hemisphere. I borrowed this from CBI Now. Thank you, Ellen. I didn't ask permission ahead of time, but I didn't think you would mind too much. So when we're looking at the occipital lobe, it's broken up into these different sort of strands of function. Including part of the temporal lobe also has a role in vision. And then, again, we're thinking about the brain as a series of connections. The dorsal stream and the ventral stream here, so vision comes in through your eyes, it goes to the back of the occipital lobe, and now it's going out to communicate what you see to other parts of the brain. So it starts, your brain sees here, and then as you start to go out, it's where we're processing vision. I told you earlier that if we were to take the brain and unfold it, it would be about the size of a dinner napkin. If we were to take your one occipital lobe and unfold it, it would be about the size of a pear. And that pear is broken up into two main parts, with the fovea, the red here. This is where you see details sharp. This is your central field of acuity. And then out here is your peripheral vision. So most of your visual cortex is devoted to that central field of vision where you have 100% acuity. If a child has had an occipital lobe lesionectomy, please pull that surgical report, because what we want to know is, was that lesionectomy in a region where only the peripheral vision was involved, like the far periphery? Or was that lesionectomy in an area involving the central vision? Because then they're going to lose that central acuity in the eye opposite the removed lesion. So really important to understand exactly what the child had removed. Someone thanks me for everyday language. Yeah, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I like food. If you can't tell, it's really helpful for me to think about. I actually think of the brain as a croissant. You know how you can open up all the layers of the croissant. That also helps me. But yeah, thinking of it as something that you can unfold is helpful for me too. Thanks for that. Okay, what will happen if I remove both occipital lobes of the brain in their entirety? Can anyone tell me? If you're not a doctor, you'd be totally blind. No, you need your occipital lobes to see. If you remove one occipital lobe, you lose half your vision opposite the removed occipital lobe. And we'll cover that in detail. I don't know what the heck is happening with this presentation. I'm really sorry about this. It keeps popping me back to prior slides. I'm really sorry about this, folks. Let me get out of this for a second. Audrey, can you unmute and take any questions?
Sure. Let's see if we have any questions here. Can see motion and color, some motion and color. Was that in response to the question?
If you remove both occipital lobes?
Oh, Ellen is asking, says you can see some motion and color if you remove both occipital lobes.
I don't think you can see anything.
I don't think so either. I remember Dr. Lawrence did a webinar for us last year, and we talked about this, about how, yes, the information is sent to other lobes for processing, but the first place it goes is the occipital lobe. So if the surgeon removes both occipital lobes, the other lobes can't process that motion and color because it didn't receive that information.
Right. You're totally blind. You would be totally blind. I really hope the slides work. Okay, so here are just an example of the complexity of the connections coming from the occipital lobe. Really quite beautiful, but also helps us understand, again, how intricately the occipital lobe works with other parts of the brain. No. Okay. The left side of the brain processes vision from the right side of the visual field and vice versa. Now, I know this is kind of complicated, but you can see here the left eyeball vision from the right side, the right half of that eyeball is processed by the left side of the brain. And the right eyeball, again, vision from the right side of that eyeball is processed from the left side of the brain. And vice versa for the left side of both eyeballs. So if you remove the entire left occipital lobe, you lose all the vision on the right side of both eyes. And this is straight down the middle. So not only do you use all the peripheral vision, but the child also loses half their vision. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on this in the next hour because it really will have an impact on how they orientate and orient themselves and move. Orientate's not a word. Orient themselves and move through space, as well as how they learn to read, especially if they have a right-sided visual field loss. When a child has had a temporal lobe lobectomy, often, but not always, they will have an upper right quadrant visual field loss, and sometimes they will have a total hemianopia. Let me take that back. When you have a temporal lobectomy, I believe you always have an upper quadrant field loss opposite the removed temporal lobectomy. I'm going to triple check that data and get back to you in an email. But what you need to be aware of is sometimes in a temporal lobectomy, the child can lose half their visual field, have a true homonymous hemianopia. All you need to know about that is that everyone's Myers loop is different. You and I don't have the same Myers loop. So removing the temporal lobe in your brain may only give you an upper right quadrant field loss. In my brain, it might cause a total hemianopia. And this is also true in a parietal lobectomy. And we don't see kids often enough getting referred for visual field evaluations after temporal or parietal lobectomies. I would love it if you know if a child's had one of those two procedures, then they should be referred for a visual field assessment, because they may have a hemianopia that hasn't been reported. The surgeon hasn't let the family know that that's a possibility.
Monica, there's a question. Is this a total field loss or a neglect?
It's a total field loss. It's a total. You can also have a neglect on top of it. And in hemispherectomy, for example, so that's a removal of or disconnection of the entire hemisphere, the child has lost all of their visual field, and as a result, will neglect that side completely. But they have lost their vision. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on this in the next hour. This is what those connections look like in the brain. I mean, it's wild how complicated they are. So you can see if you remove a little bit of, let's say you do a lesionectomy here, you used a laser and you burned off a little piece, that is going to impact how that vision, whatever part of the visual cortex that piece was removed from, it will have an impact. You can just see here all of these layers of bundles of neuron fibers and how they're communicating, and how just zapping a little piece here, now that's going to have an impact on this vision there. And then when we think of vision, you really have to think about it just in terms of the entire function that the child is trying to do. So they may be thinking, I'm going to plan for movement, so that movement plan goes into the supplementary motor area. The muscles are moved, but at the same time, the child's looking at the ball that they want to hit with that movement. It goes back to the occipital lobe. It has to go over here to the temporal lobe, that message, to remind him of what a ball looks like and how to hit it, and the sound that the ball makes when you actually hit it, and where their arm is in space when they're hitting that ball. All very complicated. Again, because now we don't think about the brain as regions alone, but we're thinking about it of how it communicates together. So very challenging for these kids when they have these visual impairments. All right, I'd like to talk a little bit about the research that we've either inspired or funded. We have a great working relationship with Dr. Marlene Berman, who's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and she's at Carnegie Mellon. And she does quite a bit of research on visual perception in children that have had parts of the visual cortex removed. So in this research study, she looked at 10 children that had resections on one side of the visual cortex. And all of them had different parts of the visual cortex removed on one side. So they had the fusiform face area removed, which is required for facial recognition. Some of them had an area around the hippocampus removed that is required for processing scenes or locations. Others had the area that is required for object recognition removed, and others had the visual word form area removed. And 8 out of 10 of the patients had normal perceptual performance, including face and object recognition. And so again, the other side of the brain in 8 out of 10 of these kids was able to recoup the functions of the part that was removed during surgery. So it's really fascinating what many of these kids can overcome. Not very good news. This paper came out of the team in England, where they looked at the visual function in children 20 years after hemispherectomy. One thing they found is that the eye opposite the removed hemisphere loses acuity over time, and this is not something that can be corrected with glasses. They also, their visual field got more constricted years later. So if you have a child that had hemispherectomy when they were very young, and now they're a teenager, now they're transitioning to adulthood, very important to keep making sure they're assessed by a neuro-ophthalmologist, because at least in these 4 adults that they assessed, they had problems with their vision later on in life. Is this going to happen to all of the kids after these hemispherectomy? We don't know, but we do know that in these 4 kids, they did have problems. This is a paper I co-wrote with the team at UCLA. We sent out surveys to parents after hemispherectomy surgery to understand how their children see, and 93% of them reported that the child had difficulties with their peripheral vision. 62% of the children had a torticollis. My son had that, Audrey. I don't know if your son had that, but where they would have kind of this head tilt. We don't know why they do the head tilt. Some of the we kind of had a little argument with the researchers here. They kept saying it was in order to correct for the visual field loss, because if you've lost this visual field, you're going to tilt your head like this to bring the visual field that you can see upward. But in a hemispherectomy, you've also impacted the motor strip that is responsible for the positioning of your muscles, the control of your muscles. And we don't know if that head tilt is because they are having a hard time controlling their head after surgery. 49%, so almost half of the kids had a strabismus after surgery, with most of them had the eye opposite the removed hemisphere was deviating out, a pretty big percentage of them. And a third of those kids underwent strabismus surgery. My son had strabismus surgery at 1.5 years. That's how we were able to make sure that he had, he doesn't talk, so I didn't know if he was seeing double, for example, when his eyes would wander. So we wanted to make sure that was corrected. And patients who had surgery younger, or those with hemimegalencephaly, which was my son's etiology, or Sturge-Weber syndrome, were likely to develop strabismus and torticollis. So you might have a young child in your class who had hemispheric surgery, and understand that they may have a strabismus, and it's important to make sure that that child is followed by a neuro-ophthalmologist, because they may also need surgery, or an ophthalmologist. Okay. The other paper we wrote, again, this is around hemispherectomy, was also based on surveys, and 71% of the parents reported that the child had a visual field defect after surgery. This is a big problem, and I will tell you why. Because this means that 29% of the parents did not understand or know that their child had a homonymous hemianopia. And I'm still surprised to this day how many surgeons describe homonymous hemianopia as a peripheral field loss, a peripheral vision loss, because to a lay person, your peripheral vision means this, but medical peripheral vision, true definition of peripheral vision, is all the way up into your central field. And we know that they also lose half of the central field. So this really worries me, is that we still have a lot of educating to do, not only for our parents, but also to the neurosurgeons, is to make sure that the parents understand that a contralateral homonymous hemianopia is an unavoidable side effect of a hemispheric procedure, as well as from an occipital lobe removal. 79% of the kids use compensatory mechanisms such as head tilting, and 56% of patients or kids experience a decrease in their visual acuity over time, with 25% of those parents reporting that over time that did improve. This paper just came out from the Carnegie Mellon team And it showed that even after hemispherectomy, the kids did not, it really did not impact their ability to recognize words or faces. And they came out and assessed kids at our 2019 family conference. So it was really exciting for us, for our families, to see that their involvement in research resulted in a really important research paper. So the children that they assessed had about an 80% task accuracy for visual classes, different visual tasks, and it was high relative to the brain volume resected. So you would assume if you have half your brain removed that you're going to lose 50% of your visual processing abilities. But the truth of the matter is they did not. They were still about 80% accurate. However, they did still perform worse than their neurotypical peers when it came to these visual tasks. This paper just came out. I haven't read it. Actually came out about a year ago. Linda, I think you and I need to do a deeper dive on this, but it's the same author from that hemispherectomy paper who said that over time, the children lose acuity opposite the removed hemisphere, and that the visual system, the visual field constricts. They're also seeing a long-term degeneration of the visual system over time after hemispherectomy. So we really want to understand what this means for our population of kids that have had these big procedures, thinking about, exactly what's happening to their vision long-term. All right, I'm going to take a brief break here for about 2 minutes to switch to another presentation.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or just unmute and ask your question.
Hi, this is Ellen Mazel. I have a question, sort of back to the occipital lobe. I've had children who have what looks like their complete occipital lobe is black, and yet they do seem to be able to see. They seem to be able to recover some motion ability. Like I have a student who can tell who people are by the way they move. Or she can see an object moving, but not stable things. So that confuses me. Like, why can she do that? Like, I can't understand if you have no occipital lobe, how she can do that. And then she did have a bit of color ability as well.
This is a child who has no occipital lobe on either side?
Yes, yes.
I think we need one of the doctors in the room to answer that question.
Yes.
Did you hear the question, Monica?
No, sorry, my son had surgery 2 days ago. The hospital bed's about to be delivered. What was the question?
So Monica, we're talking about the occipital lobe, and I've had 2 situations where children who look on an MRI as if their occipital lobe is black. I mean, it's just black, and yet they've recovered some ability to see motion and color, and I can't understand how they can do that. If
both occipital lobes?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Well, looks like both in both cases, and very, 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 very blind children. But yet they have this. Both of the children, they were actually young adults, so they still had their language. So it just confuses me. Like, why can they do that?
Linda says it's called blind sight. She commented in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm on or not, but there's some really fascinating explanations of this on the CVI Scotland website, Blind Sight, where and nobody can really explain exactly which neural pathways are doing this, but some people who don't have the occipital lobes can see things that are moving, and there's some really dramatic stories on that. So I'd take a look. It'll make you understand it, even though we can't really explain why.
I'd also wonder, maybe they have just enough cortex, on MRI, it looks like it's obliterated, but remember I said 1 millimeter of brain contains 50,000 neurons. Maybe they have just enough to sense motion or a light or something like that. We also have a lot of research around blind sight after hemispherectomy. Elaine Petito out of Montreal is doing a lot of that research. So these children are missing the occipital lobe on one side, but they have a subconscious awareness of things like a ball coming at them in their blind side, even though the occipital lobe is removed. Yeah. Any other questions? See the chat here. Okay. This is probably redundant for many of you, but let me know. I'd like to just talk about your fields of vision, and this is what you see when your eyes are fixed in one position, looking at one thing. Again, left side of the brain takes in information from the right side of the visual field, right side of the brain from the left visual field. And it's very helpful to think about your vision as an island of vision. So this is what I use to explain to families when they say, well, the surgeon told me they would only use their peripheral vision. What they didn't explain to you is that, again, peripheral vision for a layperson is one thing, but peripheral vision really means everything except that central field of vision right in the middle. If you were to stick your thumb straight out and look at your thumbnail, that's the size of your central field of vision. That is the only part of the visual field where you see at 100% acuity. So you have to move your eyeballs to get your central field of vision over something in order to see it at 100% acuity. So again, right here in the middle is where you see detail sharp, and then movement and changes in brightness are on the outside. Color, you see out here, you start to see shapes here. Text, you really have to get it into that central field of vision. This is a much better presentation live, but if what I will do at our conferences is ask a parent to try to read a card that's starting to come into their field of vision here, and you really can't read it until the card gets right in front of you. It's hard to read it from the side. And this is how your two sides of two different eyes look at the field of vision, and then they overlap in order to form the visual field. Linda, you and I have talked a lot about, how important it is to correct that strabismus, because you want the eyes to overlap to get that binocular field. Also, if the eyes don't overlap, the brain will sort of shut out one eye so that it's getting a clear image from the other eye, because when your two eyes are misaligned and don't overlap, you're going to have a challenge. My son, after his strabismus surgery, had a terrible bout with hydrocephalus. He can no longer move his left eye out or both eyes up. And with the left eye now, he's almost totally blind in that eye, because the brain has just said, we're not really getting good information from that eye. And so he's lost almost all his vision from that left eye at this point. So if a child has the left occipital lobe removed, or a left temporal parietal occipital lobectomy, or a left hemispherectomy, they've lost their entire field of vision on the right of both eyes, straight down the middle. And remember, what's in the middle? Your central field of vision. So not only have they lost that peripheral vision, they've also lost half of that central field. And so this is just kind of mimicking what that looks like. It helps me to think about the visual field loss as contact lenses. If you were to put a contact lens that's half black over both eyes, that visual field loss would be following the eyeballs. This is kind of just a little way to take a look at what the visual field loss is in real life. So if I were to ask you to look at that airplane, and don't move your eyeballs off the airplane, but something is going to come into your field of vision, keep your eyeballs on the airplane. And is anyone able to tell me what is probably underneath that airplane? Keep your eyeballs on the airplane. Somebody want to try it? You can unmute yourself. Don't keep your eyes off the airplane.
We have one guess of car.
A car, that's a good guess. It's probably also because of context, you're thinking, so you probably were able to also see that the shape was rectangular, what the color was. Now something else is going to come into your visual field. Again, keep your eyes on the airplane. Don't cheat, don't move your eyeballs off the airplane. Does anybody know what's in that now that's in your visual field? Don't move your eyes off the airplane. So it's something colorful, maybe red.
Something orange.
Something orange. Okay, now you can look at it. It's Nemo. But you weren't able to see what it was until you moved your central field of vision onto that. Now we're going to try something else. Remember, the central field is where you see text at 100% acuity. In the next paragraph, I want you to focus your eyes only on the green word, just the green word. And you're going to try to read the entire paragraph, but you're not going to move your eyeballs from the green word. So look at the word the. Can anybody read the entire paragraph without moving their eyeballs from the word the? Any words that you see? Don't look at them, just look at the word the. Can anyone read it? You can't, because you have to move your eyeballs over the words in order to see the text. So you have 100% acuity at the fixation point, the point your eyeballs are looking at, and then at acuity drops. Now, why do we care? Well, if you've lost half of your central field of vision, you're only going to see half a word. Now, your parafoveal field gives you a hint of where to go next in the line when you're reading. And if you've lost half of that, you're not going to know where you go next. Adults who have had damage to the left occipital lobe so that they have a right hemianopia report a tremendous dislike of reading because they're reading into nothingness, with many of them stopping, they won't read anymore. It becomes very frustrating with them. So you can see now how challenging it might be if you're teaching a child how to read that has a left or a right hemianopia, because the word's cut in half. And if it's a right hemianopia, they don't even know where to go next in the line with the word. So let's try this exercise again. Don't move your eyeballs off of that purple car. But now you have a right hemianopia. So you're looking at that car. You've lost all your vision here on the right. Now something is going to come into your vision. Don't look at it and tell me what you see. Now you look over at it. It's a deer. But when you look over at it, you've now lost the road in front of you. And this is why about half of the states in the country prohibit someone with homonymous hemianopia from learning how to drive. Or from driving altogether. If you go to our YouTube channel, there's a great presentation by a researcher from Harvard who, Bowers is her last name, Alex Bowers. There's a lot of research on driving with homonymous hemianopia, and it's quite interesting and frightening. A lot of the drivers, and these are drivers that have no other impairment, so they don't have any kind of hemiparesis, they don't have a cognitive challenge, and they frequently hit pedestrians in the crosswalk because they are suddenly surprised by a pedestrian who appears because they haven't received the cues from seeing them coming into the crosswalk. So now for you O&M specialists, you've got a child with a significant visual field loss who's playing with his friend on the playground, but because he can't see that ball, now you can see how there are misconceptions. So really important for them to understand how that how they have to constantly be scanning for things when they're walking and when they're playing with their classmates. If they're in a busy hallway, they could very easily bump into people coming in. Audrey, you tell a great story quickly of how once you were riding bicycles with Bennett and you had a challenge, and Bennett's in college now, but a few years ago. Yeah.
So Bennett had a right hemispherectomy as a left homonymous hemianopia. And we were on the Great Highway in San Francisco, which is kind of what it sounds like. It's a big open roadway. And periodically it's closed to cars so that people can go walk and bike and whatnot. And my husband and I were behind, and my younger son was on his bike, and my son Bennett was on his trike. And we're like, just stay on the yellow line, as you're going. And we were hanging back a little bit, giving them some space. And then I see Bennett just literally run over someone who is walking on the yellow line with his wife, and just rams his bike over this guy and knocks him to the ground because Bennett had turned his head to the right to look at his brother, who probably said something goofy, and couldn't see anything anymore on the left. So he completely missed this guy and literally just ran into him. And at first the couple was so mad at us. And then I explained, he's visually impaired, but I think the guy was pretty badly hurt. It was very upsetting. And that might be the last time he rode his trike, because it's like, even in an open space, there were really no people around. This guy just like literally came out of nowhere for us as well. We didn't see him because we were hanging back a little bit from them, but it was very scary. And you can see what a big impact that could be. And we were lucky that he wasn't more hurt than he was. And my son was not hurt either. So
yeah. So now let's take that up to another level. Now you have a child with the right homonymous hemianopia or left homonymous hemianopia. They're looking at mom's coming to get them, and they don't see that there's a bus coming. So very important for O&M specialists to really work very closely with these kids, not just in in elementary school, but really throughout that transition to adulthood, to make sure that they really know how to navigate space. Hemianopia is an invisible disability. You can bump into people, as you just shared, Audrey, have misunderstandings, can bump into objects and harm themselves. My son has terrible depth perception because of his eyes being so misaligned. He cannot tell when there's ever a change in elevation, and has broken his arm, his finger, and clavicle, all from just falling on something, over something really very, very small, but he just is totally unaware of something being there. It may be hard for them to pour beverages, and they may reduce their participation in social life, sports, and recess. Audrey, you just said your son really doesn't want to ride his bike anymore. They're afraid of bumping into people. O&M specialists are terrific because they have these great interventions and trainings that they can do. First, of course, would be a comprehensive evaluation, both in static, dynamic, familiar, and unfamiliar environments. They can teach the kids to make spontaneous, looking to the blind side as often as possible, so that they understand that they have that visual impairment. Especially if the child had surgery when they were young, they don't see black in this lost visual field. They see what you and I see behind us. We don't see black. We just don't see. We lack vision. And so making sure that they understand that they have an impairment that other people don't have. We had one young girl, she had a hemispherectomy at 3 months old, and I'll never forget how challenging it was for her mom, because her daughter kept saying, but mom, you say that I have a vision problem, but I don't have a vision problem. Well, if she's grown up all her life, she's just able to see this, it's hard to explain to her that you're really supposed to be able to see much more. It can be really challenging. One thing we talk about is whether children with a homonymous hemianopia should use a cane, a white cane, so that they can cue others. I've met over, almost 1,000 kids that have had a hemispherectomy, for example, through our work. I only know 2 that use a white cane to cue others. And so helping them maybe overcome the stigma in some circles that is associated with using a white cane might help them be safer when they're out in public. And then we talked a little bit before from the research on what the kids can do to accommodate for that visual field loss. Learning how to read can be very challenging. The word alpine, when you're looking at it, just looks like the word ALP. So TBIs can use something called last letter cancellation therapy. If it's a right hemianopia, getting the children to first cancel the last letter with a big red pen so that they understand there's always where the end of a word is, and then opposite if it's a left hemianopia. We're always telling them that, you might want to look at a word a little bit off to the side. So if your visual field is here, then you're going to see more of the word. But if you're reading a word in the center, you're going to lose some of it. And then keeping the print smaller. This is really very important to work very closely with the family on this. I know often we might think that for a child with a visual impairment, the text should be bigger. But if a child has a hemianopia, actually, if the text is smaller, then they can see more of it. So really working with that family, working with the child to see what size text really works for them. Not always, saying it's going to have to be bigger text, really working closely with them to see what size text works best. They're learning how to read. You might think about presenting the text vertically at first. Some parents have found success with, just getting a highlighter pen and running it in the margin so that they understand where the paragraph ends. Obviously doing the opposite if it's the other side, if it's a visual field loss on the other side. And then again, paying particular attention to ocular motor control, because this can also be impaired with some epilepsy surgeries, especially if we're touching the premotor cortex or the motor cortex or any of the regions below that have involvement in ocular motor control. This is how you and I read. So we will very quickly make a series of small jerky movements and linger on a word for a quarter or less of a second. And by measuring these pauses, you can discover exactly how you read and how long it would take you to read. And this is Audrey's son reading. Again, he's in college at Cal State East Bay. He had the right half of his brain removed. But look at the challenge that he has with ocular motor control, reading back to the beginning of a paragraph or back to the beginning of a sentence. You see him often reading over the same word a few times to get it in.
On one line, oops, that's a tracking error. That's a good return to sweep. Some little regressions there. That's a tracking error. Then went back to pick it up. He jumped over some information there, but he got the question regarding it's a tracking error there.
For a TBI, work really closely with the literacy specialist to make sure that that specialist understands, especially when you're testing for fluency, that the poor fluency may be related to the ocular motor control issue or the hemianopia, that they just can't take in the information fast enough to be testing high on fluency rating scales. Adults who have hemianopia report what's known as a hemianopic dyslexia. This is in a great paper published in 2008. So they may have poor word identification, reduced reading speed, reading errors, compromised visual exploration. Reading may just be too difficult. Many of them give up reading. And so look at how hard it must be for a child learning how to read when they can't see the whole word, they can't see the end of the sentence. And now you're starting to stack up barriers to literacy for them. So really working with them closely to correct maladaptations like guessing words. We don't want them doing that. Making sure they have intensive reading intervention, supervised reading instruction, and then training on, getting those eyeballs to move in the right speed, etc. We talked about the dorsal and ventral field. We're going to move now to hearing and listening. If a child has had the temporal lobe resected in part or removed in part, or the entire lobe removed in a bigger procedure like a full temporal lobectomy or a hemispherectomy or TPO, they are going to have challenges with hearing and listening. Why? Because your auditory cortex, the part of the brain that first processes sound, is in your temporal lobe. Well, I'd like you to understand this because, again, we think about the brain all working together. So if you have a vision problem as well as a hearing challenge, you're going to start seeing issues with orientation and mobility. If you can't hear where the sound of a playmate running towards you and you also can't see them, then this is all going to be a challenge. Now, here's your peripheral hearing system. Sound comes in, eventually gets over to your auditory nerve, and then it goes to your auditory cortex, which is organized by hertz, and pretty fascinating. Somebody want to say something? No. The more complicated sound gets, the more your brain is involved in processing sound.
Sorry,
Yeah.
there is a question. Is this labeled as an auditory processing disorder or is it called something else?
It's a central auditory processing disorder. Yeah. Yeah. And I personally, I find in many circles, this is thought of as not something that's real, but when you look at the brain and where it processes sound, you're going to have a visual processing disorder. If some parts of the occipital lobe are removed or disconnected, you're going to have problems with movement if part of the motor cortex is removed or disconnected, and you're going to have challenges with hearing and listening. Okay. If I speak the word dog into your right ear and the word cat into your left ear, do you hear both words at the same time, or will you hear one of the words first? Will you hear both words at the same time, or will you hear one of the words first? Who wants to try that one? Nobody wants to try it? If your left hemisphere is responsible primarily for speech, for processing speech, what word are you going to hear first? You're going to hear the word dog. Yes, you're going to hear the word dog first. So if both are spoken at the same time, the word dog comes in about a split second faster than the word cat, because the word cat will go into the right hemisphere and then via the corpus callosum will go across to the left side of the brain that will process speech. So if a child has had a corpus callosotomy or has had the auditory cortex removed on this side or on this side, you can see where they're going to start having problems with processing that word dog or cat. Now, let's say they've had the left temporal lobe removed in its entirety. Would they hear the word dog or cat first? They would hear the word cat. Would they hear the word dog? Again, we're speaking both words into each ear at the same time. Dog into the right ear, cat into the left ear. They would not hear the word dog at all. They would not hear the word dog at all because the word dog has nowhere to go. The word cat would be heard first because it would be processed by the right hemisphere. And this is actually, there's published research about it in what's called a dichotic environment, an environment where you have multiple sounds coming into the ear at the same time. The sound that's coming in to the ear opposite the removed hemisphere is totally extinguished in that environment. So the more complex the hearing environment is, the more difficult it is for the child to read, to understand what they're listening to. This is also called the cocktail party effect. If you and I are in a cocktail party and there's a couple arguing next to us, I might be able to say to you, listen, can you hear them? They're really having a pretty bad fight. We can focus our attention to that conversation. This is very difficult to do if you've had one of your temporal lobes removed or disconnected. And so in these situations where you have dichotic digits, dichotic words, or dichotic vowel sounds, this is research from Dr. Frank Musiak, who's really known as sort of the father of central auditory processing. We're very honored that he's on our scientific advisory board. The ear opposite the removed temporal lobe is extinguished in environments with multiple speakers. So just quickly, if you have, this is the ipsilateral ear, the ear on the same side of the removed hemisphere or the removed temporal lobe can hear fine, but opposite, way down, very difficult to hear. How does this affect phonological awareness when a child is learning how to read? We think it's possible that it affects it quite a bit. So I'm working very hard to initiate some research around this, but you can start to see how in the school environment that now you have a visual impairment that might be significant. Now you have an auditory impairment that might be significant. It makes it difficult for you to understand words. It makes it difficult for you to understand the teacher when she or he is instructing you. Now we kind of are furthering that recipe for illiteracy, that a recipe for lower educational attainment because of all these barriers that we have. So speech and noise is a very common challenge in children that have had temporal lobectomy or hemispheric surgery. You might see that they're confused. They can't hear some words. Sometimes it's mistaken that they're ignoring you or they're rude. They may be overwhelmed. A lot of times we see in our community, the kids will have headphones on, and it's for a reason because they cannot process sound like you or I can. So we really want to make sure you're working with the team to help them understand that we should work on phonological awareness. When you're working with that child, make sure you're speaking clearly and deliberately. Repeat if necessary, ask for understanding. Very important to reduce the ambient sound. If you're instructing a child, especially around these core topics like learning how to read, for example, you don't want a fan in the room or an air conditioner or instructing them near a window where there's a gardener outside, because it's going to be very difficult for them to kind of keep all these sounds out while they're trying to learn how to read. Just quickly, they also have trouble localizing sound. So we localize sound. If sound is coming into both ears at the same time, we know it's in front of us. If sound comes first into the left ear and then at the right ear, the brain knows it's off to the left or to the right. When it's a fixed sound, in other words, the sound is coming from just one location, the kids after hemispherectomy have a challenge localizing that. And it gets much worse if that sound is moving. They really, above the line is bad. So when they have a moving sound, they really have a very difficult time localizing that sound. Why do we care from an orientation and mobility standpoint about sound? Because when do you use sound? When do you localize sound? When you're crossing the street. We actually lost an adult in 2015 who she was hit by a bus and passed away. The bus driver said it was like he didn't even see him coming. So not only could she not see the bus, but I suspect she probably couldn't even hear where the bus was coming from because her sound localization is impaired. So I know that you were probably wondering for a while, why is she talking about hearing with vision educators? Is because for the O&M specialists especially, that the hearing can have their inability to process sound properly and to localize can have a really big impact on the kids. So again, you're looking at your mom, you can't see her, but you also Can't hear her, can't hear the bus coming. So that's a recipe for disaster. Some kids have success with noise cancellation headphones. One thing Dr. Music told me is he wondered, if you just put an earplug in the ear opposite the removed hemisphere or opposite the removed temporal lobe, and just so that no sound comes in that ear, that they might be able to process better from that remaining ear that has a hemisphere to go into. And just quickly, when we're looking at surgeries to the frontal lobe, so removing that motor strip or a hemispheric surgery, you're going to have a contralateral hemiparesis. This is how the brain, or I'm being mindful of time here, this is how the brain organizes your motor function. And there's a lot of brain space that's dedicated to the arm and the hand. And so children, if they've had a total and complete frontal lobectomy, including the motor strip, or a hemispheric surgery, they're going to have a very weak hand opposite that removed hemisphere. If they've had a parietal lobectomy, remember we talked about sensory processing. Parietal lobectomy has sensation coming in, so they're going to have a contralateral loss of sensation in all of these areas as well. And if the motor strip has been removed, they're going to have a significant loss of function in all these areas. So problems with taste, problems with moving the mouth, and a lot of loss of hand function. So again, really important to really understand where the surgery has been in order to understand the impact on the rest of the body. And this is just, if you were to map out your brain function onto a person, into a homunculus, look at how much function of the brain is devoted to the hand and how much to the lips and the tongue. And this is just the connection from the brain, the corona radiata that eventually forms your spinal cord. Why can some of the kids walk after a big surgery, removing the motor strip? Motor strips up here. Most of those connections go down, they form the spinal cord eventually. They cross to control the opposite side of the body, but some of them don't cross. They go down to the same side of the body. So this is why the kids can generally walk after such a big surgery, is because these tiny little connections, these very mild connections, thin connections that go down in the body, are just enough to move the big muscles of the thighs and the bigger muscles of the upper extremity, the arm, but they are not enough to return fractionated movements to the hand or significant movements to the ankle and foot. This is a whole other presentation, the connections of the brain to the spinal cord. When we're looking at kids that have had these bigger surgeries, hemispherectomy, TPO, you're going to see, especially in the weeks and months following the surgery, generally decreased endurance, so difficulty staying active for a long time, but this tends to decrease with time after surgery. My son, by 8 o'clock, he's totally wiped out. He's got to go to bed. He's 16. His little brother's 13 and can stay up till 2 in the morning if he has to. He's neurotypical. You might see the fatigue. We encourage core subjects to be taught in the morning when you don't have a fatigue. Again, if they've had a big hemispheric surgery, on the opposite side, you're going to see weakness, most prominent in the hands and feet, decreased accuracy, dexterity, and speed, risk of shoulder and hip dislocation over time. My son needed a hip osteotomy when he was 12, I think, and he just had his third foot surgery because of spasticity. Altered muscle tone, so spasticity and contracture or clonus. And interestingly, they have decreased pain, pressure, and temperature sensation on the opposite side of the body. So especially if you're working with the littles, they need to be very aware that they may not feel a broken bone. We've had a lot of situations where kids have broken their bones and the kids had no idea that they had, or they didn't cry, they didn't scream like a kid typically would when they broke their bone. They also have a risk of burning because they can't sense heat very well. And on the same side of the surgery, we also see some challenges. So again, I'm talking about the bigger hemispheric surgeries, reduced force production. So some of them have trouble with writing, finger tapping, have trouble playing musical instruments, because again, remember I showed you how the connections from the remaining side of the brain go down to the same side. But if you've removed the opposite side, not only have you removed the connections going across, but you've also removed the connections going to the same side. So you'll see some changes in the good hand too. So primarily, like with writing and things like that, occupational therapists should make sure that they don't ignore that, the good hand that remains after surgery. I'll just revisit again the whole issue of cognition after surgery. We do see an improvement in cognition postoperatively, because remember now, hopefully the seizures have been controlled, and now we're removing medication. You might start seeing improvement. So about 90% of children after epilepsy surgery see between a 5 to 15% increase in IQ points, or they're flat. Most of them do see an improvement, and about 10% will see a decline in their cognition. Be patient. Some of these kids have slow progress. The trajectory is long. There was a great paper that came out of the group in Greater Mond in England, that improvement can be as far as 10 years out and is strongly correlated with seizure control. So be very patient with them. You're really going to start to see improvement throughout time, through 11 years after surgery. My husband and I are marveling at our son. He's got a pretty significant intellectual impairment. His last surgery, epilepsy surgery, was in 2010. But we have very recently, he's a teenager now, have started seeing him do some things that are really indicating that his cognition is starting to improve a lot. So there's always hope on the horizon for these kids. I think that's it. I don't know if we want to cover literacy. I could take questions. We've got about 15 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions? I think Audrey stepped off for a moment. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Monica, it's Linda Lawrence here. Just a couple of comments from kind of our perspective here in Kansas. And I like people to remember that, you know, something caused the seizures to begin with. And so we can't ever look at the kids with just, okay, what's the effect of the surgery? But we have also the effect of whatever brought us to that point of needing the surgery. And even though we may see improvement, that we still have to remember that some of our kids, the underlying etiology and damage done from the surgery, the kids are going to look different. And that every child, even with the same diagnosis and the same surgery, is going to be absolutely different. And that's why, you know, it's just so important for every child to have the proper assessment. The other thing in Kansas, one of the things that we've done is, at least for the kids I've seen, they also all get a CVI diagnosis. I don't know, I came in a little late, so I don't know if you talked about that, but we consider kids who have had these types of brain surgeries to have brain-based visual impairment. I mean, it only makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's helpful to put in the words, or, you know, be sure that we understand that, so that, again, the child can get the proper resources. And the third thing we're doing, and those of you who from Kansas who've worked with me, and Monica, I know we've talked about this, and it's so cool. You need to see our eye gaze, because even though, you know, it's not an evidence-based procedure right now, it's showing us a little bit about the functional vision of these kids, because, you know, you can do a visual field, but that's very static, you know, and we can only guess how they might use their field of vision in a variety of situations. But the eye gaze is giving us a little more information, because it's just one extra little clue to help us understand how the kids see. So hopefully, I know our through KSSB, the School for the Blind, they've been doing some talks. So hopefully more people will be aware of this and look at it objectively.
Great. Yes, by definition, they all have a cerebral vision impairment. Whether that's teased out appropriately will depend on the assessment used. I would just make sure that you are careful with the assessments that are used. I know the CVI range can give an artificially high score for many of these children, and a lot of schools depend on that range and will pull services if the child scores really highly. Now that you know how significant the impairments can be, especially when we've removed an entire occipital lobe and you have the contralateral hemianopia, they're only seeing half a word, they can't read the sentence. Just be careful with the assessments you use. Make sure you use several different assessments, because you may not be able to tease out all those different assessments in all those different impairments just with one assessment.
The other thing that was touched upon too, especially at the very end, was, and to me, it's so important to have physical therapy and orientation mobility work together with these kids, because they're going to have and of course OT too. I mean, we need the whole team, but it's not just an O&M. O&M can't do it on their own. PT can't do it on their own. They really need a coordinated approach to keep that child safe and independent.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, PT thinks it's an comms issue and vice versa. And then the child doesn't get really what they need, which is both intensively.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is Molly. I don't have a question. I just want to comment and say thanks for putting this together. It was wonderful. I know I've gotten a couple messages saying that people have really liked it and enjoyed the presentation. So thank you for doing it. I truly appreciate your work on it.
Oh, thank you, Molly. Sorry about the typos.
Oh gosh, I don't care about that.
And you guys be sure and go to the website too, because there's just a lot of this information, I mean, Monika will put this on so you can see it again. And if you're like me, you probably need to see it about 20 times to really get everything in your own brain. But look at the website. There's a lot of resources. There's some specific things for vision, for hearing, and just a wealth of information.
I'll put we just moved over to a new website. If you just put vision in the search bar, you'll see all of the different pages that are dedicated to vision.
Yeah, I shared in the chat a bunch of resources, and I will include them in our follow-up materials that we'll be sending to you.
Okay. Yes, please fill out the feedback and be very candid, because we're always trying to improve. So if there's something you didn't like, something I could have done better, we will work on that for next time.
If there aren't any other questions, I think we'll end here. I did want to point out that we do have a free school training for teams. So if you have a student who's had epilepsy surgery, we can create a tailored 2-hour training just for that child's procedure, where we talk similar to what Monika just did. We talk about all the functional outcomes of that specific procedure, things to look out for, and then have some time to talk about strategies and interventions that you might apply. And the link was shared with you, and I'll share it as well after the fact when I email everything to you. So please utilize that.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.